All right, and we're live.
Hey everybody, doing one of hopefully we'll have more streams, but given the essay that was just uploaded on the main channel today, I'd imagine that our time on YouTube is pretty limited. So, thanks to the lovely font choice Heretic had for titling the video, we should have, some time
It'll be.
before you what
I
was
was.
that?
I was gonna give us a couple hours before YouTube remembers that Unicode exists.
But yeah, while we're still on the platform,
But we
What's
got a
the difference
donation.
between a park bench and a black
goddamn
guy?
already.
A
Yeah.
park bench can
Nice.
support a family. What's hard and long on a black man? The first grade. What's the difference between a pothole and a black man? You swerve around the pothole.
Oh my god, that's super chat is freaking juicy. Thank you, HP Lovecraft's cat for the $5.
Yeah, appreciate it, man.
Yeah. Anyways,
Anyway, yeah. So while we're still on the platform, figure that it's I don't know. We've been responding to a lot of essays lately, and most of our streams have dealt with sort of internal debate on libertarianism. A lot of people have been asking us to revisit Marxist content lately. And frankly, I can't really imagine. Well, I can imagine a few reasons why, but frankly, it baffles me that people are still interested in that. I mean, they're still getting quite a bit of promotion in YouTube's algorithms, along with a lot of the other major social media sites. And it's especially noticeable given that content like ours is being deliberately targeted. Yeah, hey YouTube, what's up with 10 to 20 people being unsubscribed from Backalley Philosophy every time we upload a video?
hmm. No,
Getting
I'm
I
sure it's
get
nothing.
messages
I'm
I
sure. I'm
get
sure it's nothing.
messages all the time about people saying, "Hey, I was unsubscribed from your channel." But anyway, yeah. So I mean, I get why people want us to talk about it because they keep getting promoted, so a lot of people end up clicking on their content, but their content's just so shallow and empty, and and I mean, I still do eventually. I have a couple of ideas for eventually sort of creating a grand critique of Marxism in the same way that this next video is going to be sort of a
Will be
grand
used as
critique
an
of the
IGR's
general
target practicing
We got another super chat.
anti-libertarian
niggers to the
critiques.
ranch
All
dimension
right,
filthy
nice.
makes.
Appreciate it.
Commit not alive, yes,
I
writes
I
fan
would say
fiction
more if I
about
could
Dwayne
hear it,
rolling Hot
but I'm
Wheels.
not really. I'm not
Cars
on the
across
stream.
knickers, chests,
It,
filthy send knickers to Mars.
I have
silly nigger.
headphones, so if I were listening to the stream while I'm talking, that would almost certainly distract me.
That's fair
But
enough. I'm just sending you screenshots of what they say.
okay.
If you have a chance, check out the DMs because that's where I'm sending them.
Yeah,
So, anyways,
appreciate it. But
oh, and Albedo
just
asks, heard about how Janet Yellen, Fed chairman, wants the central bank in the state to regulate cryptocurrencies. Yeah, good luck.
I have heard about that, and I just have disregarded it because this is hardly the first time that the government has threatened to do that. Um, every like 3 months or so, either a major Fed personality or some congressman will say something about it, and then it just kind of gets lost in the ethos because they know damn well that there's not anything that they can do about it. That's the reason why they need to keep posturing every once in a while. It's to try and scare people who don't actually know what cryptocurrency is. At least I'm guessing that that's the reason that the IRS spam letters saying, "We know you have cryptocurrency," literally just to everybody, because they don't know, and there's no way that they'll ever figure out unless people literally like volunteer that information. So
Although I kind of like the energy that Asia is putting out in the comments here, where he's threatening the IRS with unseasoning their steak if they continue to posture in that way.
yeah, so just going back to what I was saying, there really aren't a whole lot of interesting critiques that one could make of Marxism, because really, if you want to actually have if you want to put forward a meaningful criticism that's not just like own the libs to your content, the only thing that you can really discuss in regards to Marxism is problems with their epistemology. So problems with materialism, problems with the analysis synthesis dialectic that Hegel claims to have discovered, but was actually written by Kant first. Problems with determinism, etc. And and the reason why those are the only real areas, that you could put meaningful criticism out in regards to, is because if you buy in, the problem with presuppositional argumentative frameworks is that if you buy into the premise that they're valid, or if you just entertain the idea that they're valid, it allows the party who's promoting that framework to control, based essentially on convenience, what counts as a standard of proof, or what counts as something that they're arguing against. So you can't really get anywhere unless you're just talking about their epistemology, and there really are only a few things that you can say about the Marxist epistemology, because if you've actually, like, there's this meme floating around. We've showed it before on the Backalley. It's in that like Man Ray Patrick skit format, except it's Eugene Baumboerk and Karl Marx, and it's essentially Baumboerk's criticism of Marx, and it ends with Marx just saying, "Well, you don't understand my theory." Well, if you start talking about epistemology with Marxists, it kind of breaks them, because they don't know how to handle it, because every aspect of Marxist epistemology is presuppositional.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't. So that's the reason why, in response to criticism, Marxists will like cite Karl Marx quotes a lot, because literally the basis they have for any claim they're making being true, or any claim being a statement about reality, is pretty much just, well, Marx said so.
Yeah,
But
pretty
anyway,
much. I think we should
yeah,
get into the video.
so back to the Gravel Institute. They've been putting out a lot of content hosted by Richard Wolff, making arguments. And Richard Wolff, for whatever reason, seems to be like the go-to academic that a lot of these media sites will promote in parroting Marxist talking points. And I really don't know why, because even among Marxist quote unquote academics, Richard Wolff is kind of a fucking idiot. Like, honestly, you think they would get somebody like Cockshot. I'm not saying that he's a good academic, or that anyone else would be putting better arguments forward. It's just Richard Wolff he's not very skilled as far as rhetoric goes. It's kind of easy to see through whatever arguments he puts forward. He has a bit of a colorful history that the economic policy advisor to the Greek economy prior to the collapse of their political economy in 2010, I want to say that was actually a student of his. So doesn't have a very good track record as far as his influence is concerned. And his arguments, like one of the videos that the Gravel Institute put out, not the one we're responding to today, but Profit is Theft, the title is, he overtly argues that money is the same thing as capital, and that money is just fiat, which is, wow, that's pretty bad even for a Marxist analysis.
So yeah, people can just endlessly create capital out of nothing.
But anyway, yeah.
I always can't help but wonder.
Sorry.
I just can't help but wonder if like these people ever really think about the words that come out of their mouth, or is it just a series, or is this just kind of like a the term? What's the term you use? Intellectual inbreeding.
Yeah, philosophical inbreeding.
Yeah, philosophical inbreeding, where everyone's just regurgitating each other's talking points, and you end up with an infinite loop of talking points referred to from talking points referred to from talking points, such that nobody has any idea where they actually came from, but enough academics said it that it can be cited as a reasonably credible source, such that
Sakani Gur Sakani GR Sakani GR Sakani
we got another
GR
super
Sakani
chat.
GR Sakani GR Sakani
It's not showing up though.
Sakani GR Sakani Gur Sakani Gur.
It's
okay.
Sakani Gur Sakani
it's still going.
Sakani GR Sakani
It's like one long string
Sakani GR Sakani GR Sakani GR
Well,
Sakani Gur.
Yeah, sorry that your donation didn't show up. Must have been a glitch with Streamlabs, but yeah, thanks for the donation.
Yeah, it was Asia. Donated $2. It's all just like one giant word. Yeah, thank you again. Anyways, sorry,
yeah, we've responded to Richard Wolff before. Shane Killian's done a couple videos on Richard Wolff. Our last stream, by the way, which was when he was on the Michael Brooks show, he attempted to dissect the economic calculation problem, and that was a real knee slapper. If anybody wants to see that, go back about a month in our streaming history. But
well, I mean, at least he tried.
What even was his argument against the economic Oh yeah, it was well, Walmart plans too.
Well, yeah, that's well, yeah, and we identify that with Walmart as well. That's hardly controversial. In fact, that was kind of the original observation. Anyways, I think we should get into the video because we're almost 15 minutes in.
Sure.
Hold on a second. Things are not looking right. Got my windows all mixed up here. All right, here we go. I'm sorry, we're only 3 seconds in, but I do have to say, like, the reason I titled this stream the way I did is just because of how absolutely repulsive the visuals for the Gravel Institute are. And I know I'm not alone in thinking this. I think we did it last time we did a video on the Gravel Institute or a live stream. We talked about this for a good amount of time, and it's just like, I've always been told, mostly this is Marxoids who are very quick, and just general socialists who are very quick to try to point this out to me, that like, all of the creative people are on the left. All the creative people are Marxist, socialist, SJWs, blah, 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 blah. And I just can't help but think, considering that they allegedly have such a large and vibrant talent pool for people who are willing to be incredibly creative with great skills in art, music, design, that sort of thing, that they can't find a professional graphic designer to come up with visuals that are less repulsive. I mean, I don't even know what it is about this graphic. It's unpleasant to look at. The colors just don't work. The way that they kind of just tile off just seems weird. It's I don't like it,
Yeah,
and I can't explain why. It's like it's deliberately designed to be as unpleasant to look upon as possible. I don't understand it.
yeah, we talked about this last time we addressed the Gravel Institute. The Gravel Institute, and what I had said about the Gravel Institute is that their style of presentation is a strictly worse version of PragerU. But I would say after watching a few other, a few other videos now, because they put out a couple of different videos, and at the time they only had one of them. And I would say, in terms of the argument that they put out, they're a strictly worse version of PragerU. PragerU, they don't really delve into too deeply, at the very least, um, justification for their framework, or like they don't even really touch upon principles. It's one of my biggest issues with PragerU is they just sort of they promote like a very shallow, broad, I guess what you would call a talking point version of arguments they're attempting to make. And they do that as a way to try and broadly appeal to a bunch of different groups with competing claims about what their principles are. And I've always been a critic of that strategy, because if you're promoting, because, if people start identifying with, your position, and they just start, they recognize some vague truism in talking points that are supposed to promote these principles that you're either downplaying or straight up not making the case for, well, then you're not really explaining why that's true. You're just kind of confusing people and making it more difficult for people to truly understand your argument. And that's I think it's intentional for a lot of groups, but that's also, if you're not going to assume a malicious intent on the part of these sort of grifters or these political interest groups, well, it's a problem with the whole big tent mentality that comes with political organization. There can't be internal discourse, because political organizations inherently disincentivize competition within themselves. As in, you can't have competition within a party.
Mhm.
Uh, but just going back to what I was, saying, that makes PragerU's arguments very shallow, except and their attempts to at least paraphrase the positions they were arguing against, um, occasionally misleading, but they at the very least can address at least a very shallow version of their opponent's arguments. Whereas the Gravel Institute, um, in addressing their opponent's arguments, sort of what's typical of the bread tube-esque commentary style. They use straw man characters, and they represent the opposing position with arguments that don't actually exist, or positions no one's ever actually argued. So, in terms of the quality of their arguments, the Gravel Institute is also a worse version of PragerU.
Hmm. I mean, I'll say this much: PragerU actually have professional graphic designers working on their presentation. Gravel Institute fired theirs a long ass time ago, and I'm pretty sure they got actually Richard Wolff doing all the graphics. That's just how bad they are. Anyways, let's actually get into the closest equivalent to substance that you're going to find here in this video. Let's go.
Here's something you hear a lot. Say what you will about capitalism, you can't deny it's lifted people out of poverty. I hear that all the time, especially when I'm talking about rising inequality and the vanishing middle class. The rates of extreme poverty, we are told.
God, their sound mixing is awful.
I was just thinking that.
I don't know if that's just because I'm wearing headphones or if it would sound the same if I were playing this through my speakers, but I could barely fucking hear what he just said because of how awful the sound mixing is.
Yeah, it sounds like that they fired their sound designers too, or at the very least, the person who edits his videos has absolutely no freaking idea what they're doing. Yeah, this is just a strictly worse version of PragerU in every single way. Now, let's talk about that. Is there anything to really say about this argument that he's trying to put forward? I mean, in all fairness, it is a comment that people do genuinely make. That say what you will about capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty. Yeah, people do actually say that, and I've said it myself back when I was a conservatard. So,
yeah, well, I guess we'll let him elaborate a bit more because there's not really enough to go off of to actually respond to anything without assuming a position that hasn't been established yet.
yeah, that's fair. Now, I'm just going to backtrack a bit so we can appreciate just how horrible the sound mixing is, and just like this weird, like sci-fi boppy sound. I don't even know why it's there.
Especially when I'm talking about rising inequality and the vanishing middle class. The rates of extreme...
Yeah, what is that?
Yeah, it sounds like it came out of Space Movie 1992.
Probably. It's let's just keep going.
Extreme poverty, we are told, have plummeted under global capitalism. We are told that global capitalism has cut poverty by as much as 80 or 90%. This reminds me of my mother. Whenever I ranted about how bad the situation was today, she would tell me how much worse it had been before. Be grateful for the improvements, Richard, she would say. I wasn't convinced then, and I'm not now. These champions of capitalism...
What I will add right now before Wolff starts actually arguing is we got to note the framing under global capitalism. So he's not talking. So he's made it explicitly clear that he's talking about political economy and not markets or not local economies.
Well, that's a great thing about. Sorry.
Marxists and Richard Wolff specifically tend to conflate the two. So I guess we should make the distinction. We should point that out that he's made it very clear that he's talking about political economies.
Well, that's a great thing about. Sorry, that's just the great thing about using terms like capitalism. When you get to call them out on their use of the term and try to narrow down what they actually intend to mean, and then try to make an argument based on what it is that they're actually trying to critique based on the context of their actual arguments, they can then go around and try to argue against you by just saying, you don't understand my argument. I'm not arguing against political economies. I'm arguing against capitalism.
Yeah, and just what I was going to say is I want to point that out so that when Wolff inevitably makes the bait and switch to try to either ascribe what he's talking about to market incentives, we can point out how that could not have happened without the state setting up barriers to entry and creating legal privilege for politically connected economic actors and attempting to control supply chains to benefit certain economic actors along with the state itself. But also, it's really not that, I wouldn't make this argument as, someone trying to argue against state socialism, because for one, um, I think that it's a false dichotomy to try to separate ethical ends from wealth being created or access to resources, because in order for systemic coercion, the thing that defines systemic coercion is the establishment of organizations that construct barriers to entry to stop people from being able to use their resources without being harassed. So wealth and equality of authority are an inherent entailment of libertarian ends. Those things exist when you subvert the ability of political institutions to be able to control how people can and can't associate. But the other reason why I won't is because it's not when we're talking. He's going to elaborate later in the video. He's talking mainly about the early industrial era, and as I've argued in previous videos, I think I even made this point the last time that we talked about a Richard Wolff presentation. That's not really that impressive of a statement, especially when governments, as Wolff is about to point out, arbitrarily play with what counts as poverty and actually use questionable standards of what counts as poverty. But the pre-industrial era political economies were based around mercantile models, and mercantilist models this was like prior to classical economic theory. um, Mercantilist political economies made every town a different district, and specifically as a way of, well, they made it so every town had a different local political economy, specifically because states were under the impression at the time, or at the very least acted as though local trade among the different communities within a nation diminished the amount of wealth in their the amount of resources available to the state within their political economies. So a mercantile state going to a liberal political economy, if you want to call it that, is it's not really that impressive, because literally anything would be a step up from mercantilism. That's why you could point to the Soviet Union's political economy. A lot of apologists for Stalin will point out that in some senses the Soviet political economy had made it so people, there was more production, and there were more resources available. In a very strict sense, that's probably somewhat true, because we're talking about a mercantile economy that persisted in the 20th century. So again, that's not a very high bar.
You're talking about
It's
just
also,
you're talking about just transitioning from different modes of production and different configurations of political economies into ones that are just significantly more efficient, because the previous ones turn out to be so debt laden and so inefficient that any that the technological innovations that do inevitably come about, simply create new incentives for states to associate economically and for them to forcibly configure their own political economies in such a way that make them significantly more competitive. This was the result of the transition from feudalism into mercantilism and mercantilism into the industrial era, where you had greater amounts of wealth being created, which meant more tax revenue, which meant the ability to afford greater and larger armies. Is more modes of production and greater access to goods and services for the individual going to improve people's lives and generally increase their standard of living? Yeah, absolutely. And you can see this numerous times throughout history, not just in those examples, but also the transition from, say, primitive Stone Age societies into agrarian, agricultural revolution societies. That's going to improve people's lives. Yeah, absolutely. However, simply trying to for one thing or another try to take credit for it, it really does not
Yeah.
follow, especially when you try to use that as an example either for or against one prescriptive model for organizing society from the top down over a different way of doing so.
No, mercantile states tried like hell to try and suppress industrialization. They created the guild system and copyright law as a way to try and stop that from happening.
Was that the express purpose of the guild system? My understanding is that it was
That
basically
no no
just
no that
legal.
was one of the things that the state tried to do around the 17th, that European states started trying to do around the 17th century, as a way to try and further suppress trade because of merchants law. Merchants law being a counter economic innovation that was practiced as a way to basically stop people from starving because the mercantile political economy was essentially trying to keep most of the population stuck on their farms.
It was pretty bad. Anyway, should we continue here?
Yeah, sure.
Capitalism are slick, I'll give them that, but here's why they're wrong. Their clever math comes from how they define poverty. According to the World Bank, anyone making under $1.90 a day is considered poor. Everyone else is okay. But that number isn't actually based on the living costs of any actual person. It's totally arbitrary. Could you live on $1.90 a day? The United Nations doesn't think so. They say
Yeah, and that's something that I was just talking about a moment ago, and I was actually, I perked up the first time I heard that because I don't like people ritualistically humiliating themselves. I want to see people, redeem themselves by making decent arguments. It still wouldn't have really been that decent of an argument on its own, but yeah, the World Bank standards are arbitrary, but the UN standards totally aren't arbitrary.
Do they even make any distinction whatsoever? I mean, could you live on $1.90 per day? That's that answer that
Maybe.
question is impossible to answer because I don't know.
This is a
I don't know how
categorical
that's
error.
how do you define that? Like, first off, it's counted using dollars, so you're automatically operating in the framework of fiat currency, and so it kind of
Yeah.
I kind of has to ask the question. It's also highly contextual because a
Like
dollar
I
ninety per
like I
day
said,
is going to be significantly different spending power depending on if you're in, say, some frickin' in the middle of frickin' nowhere in India versus if you're in Manhattan in New York City.
like I said, it's not really. It's at least a something something that could cause someone to start inquiring into that standard. However, yeah, there are the problems that you pointed out, but then there's also the glaring problem. There's no such thing as intrinsic wealth. There's no such thing as an intrinsic use of resources. That's marginal. What counts as wealth is subjective, and different economies, how different societies, and based on individual people's interests, are going to determine the structure of local economies. And within those, you have to sort of study each of those economies differently as a way. You can't just prescribe a standard of what counts as poverty or what counts as wealth. If you do that, you're making a categorical error from the start, because it's not what wealth is. Not how people use their resources. That's not how resources work in lived reality.
Hmm. Anyways, I'm just gonna hit continue. Let's see how far they go. Although I do have to appreciate how they're trying to insert the audience into this question. Like, can you live on $1.90 per day?
I don't know.
Uh,
Depends.
yeah,
It
that's
is the only thing I'm doing just like laying in bed. No, I'm doing different things every day.
hmm.
So
And as I said, it's that kind of that answer is highly contextual. In I can tell you 100 years ago, living on $1.90 per day would have actually been extremely comfortable.
I gotta tell you, I don't fucking have any utility for fiat currency. So
That's fair.
what my standard for $1.90 is going to be different than yours.
Hmm. Although I like what Derek Johnson said, he could last on 1 Bitcoin a day. I'm reasonably sure I
Literally
could
anybody
too.
could. You could, if you were spending a Bitcoin a day on your lifestyle, you're doing pretty well for yourself.
I'll say, freaking hell. Anyways, continuing.
Everyone would need at least 4 times that, $7.40 a day, to get the absolute minimum for, quote, basic nutrition and normal human life expectancy, end quote. Using this
Uh, that's according to the UN, right?
Yeah.
Uh, again, that's going to be highly contextual and kind of shows a problem with the very statistical shenanigans that Richard Wolff was talking about here, or was trying to criticize earlier. That he tried to criticize that the $1.90 is largely divorced from people's actual lived experiences, which is accurate. But then when similar thing happens when the UN is trying to say like that you need $7.60 for basic nutrition and normal human life expectancy, that somehow that's reasonable and accurate and not at all contextual based on the cost of living depending on where you happen to be living in the world at that particular moment in time.
It would have been at least a decent point to raise had he not a used the UN standards within a prescriptive framework, as though that somehow is more valid. And no, he's not going to explain why that's the case. Why that exception is made. And also, he also is operating around the notion that utility somehow has an intrinsic property that people operate around, which of course he does, because he's a fucking Marxist.
Mm-hmm. And yes, Dylan Goodman, they do put a picture of Karl Marx. I mean, we're dealing with Marxists here, so that's kind of expected. I just find it interesting how Richard Wolff can pick and choose which averages completely divorced from actual lived experience in the context of people's lives he considers to be horrible, and which one he considers to be great and wonderful. Anyways, let's go ahead and continue to see what he has to say, bringing up Karl Marx.
using this more realistic number,
It's more realistic. It's more realistic.
God.
Freaking like was $1.90 not realistic because it was too small?
So if a village bakes a bunch of pies and everyone in that village is allergic to the ingredients of those pies. They have no socially necessary use for those pies.
Yes,
If people came along who weren't allergic to those pies, who hiked into that village, they would have use for them.
correct.
So Marx is a brainlet.
You don't understand my theory.
Oh my god.
Anyways, let's see.
By the way, it's worth noting that Marx's work wasn't because something that a lot of Marxists will argue is that it was a damning critique, but actually it wasn't. First of all, David Ricardo, decades before Marx published Capital, pointed out why Marx's quote unquote discoveries in terms of how economic value is treated don't work logically. But also, specifically, you can't make a socially necessary caveat because that turns economic value into a tautology. But yeah, the other thing that I've pointed out previously as well is that the closest circles that he had to have any sort of influence in the would have been the libertarian movement at the time, and they all fucking hated him, and he was only able to worm his way in there because he appealed to their talking points.
Well, he was very much the
He was
Hans Hermann Hoppe of his time.
proposing political means to arrive at ends which, as I pointed out earlier, are entailed by political means.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm just going to hit continue. I just backed up a little bit.
Using this more realistic
entailed
number,
by libertarian. I meant it entailed by libertarian ends. Equality of authority, greater access to resources, more ways to use resources. That can't be done within a political economy because the purpose of political economy is to control resources. But yeah, let's continue.
All right.
Using this more realistic number, the number of people in poverty has actually increased over the last 4 decades to a whopping 4.2 billion. Poverty.
I'm curious as to how you got those numbers too, because I have a feeling those numbers are not inflation adjusted.
Yeah, I'm curious as well, but considering the standard for the standard that he's established already for what counts as poverty, there's already uh, a handful of categorical issues which I are going to lead me to believe that this is a problem. This statistic is a problem, not in the sense that it's pointing out a valid issue, but that I mean, I don't doubt that there's probably more people in poverty, but how we're categorizing poverty or what counts as poverty, and factors that lead to it, we need to have a clear explanation of what counts and why that happens in order to really do anything about it. But that's the last thing that Marxists want, because if they did that, they would keep coming back to the state. They would keep coming back to barriers to entry that are being set up by the state. They would keep coming back to privileges being created by the state. Or political actors who are protected by the state in the market, and they wouldn't be able to blame it on factors in the market because these are all created by political institutions. But anyway, let's continue.
Well, I mean, I just noticed that the graph only goes up to 2015. which I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
this video is much older than 2015, or I'm sorry, much more recent than 2015. So I'm kind of curious as to why it is that they stopped it there, and I'm kind of curious
Problem
as to
with
what it,
using
I'm kind of curious as to what it looked
sorry.
like in 2020 when the lockdowns were enacted by the state to stop hyperinflation from coming into effect.
That's the problem with using prescriptive. That's the problem with using prescriptive modeling, not as a way to try and organize economies, but just to study economies in the first place. Why? What are we counting as a criteria? Why are we studying this period of time? Those are questions that you can't answer unless you're actually um, unless you actually have a clear a clear epistemological basis for laying out this criteria. There's no way to do that within a prescriptive framework because economic preferences aren't revealed by first of all, they're revealed by individual people, and it's impossible to know them in advance because how people act, economic activity is dictated by individual preferences that are, and how people process information, how people interpret, how based on the information they process, what they take away from it at that given moment, and those are all things that are not possible to know in advance.
Mm-mm.
So
Let's continue.
yeah,
Has
sure.
gone up, not down. But hey, at least a proportion of people in poverty has gone down, they might say. But what's actually the reason for that? Was it really capitalism that was our knight in shining armor? As a matter of fact, almost all of that reduction in poverty has been in one country, China, not in the countries where American-style capitalism was exported. China
American-style capitalism. Oh boy, this is gonna be interesting.
Well, you see, what it was neoliberalism. That was the result, or that's what America imported to the rest of the world.
That is as a explanation for, first of all, that graph for reduction in poverty was even more vague than the amount of quote unquote global poverty that existed. Yeah, American style capitalism, quote unquote, is extremely vague. It's not informative at all in terms of explaining why something happened in an economy or what the basis is. If you're going to try to if you're going again to try to ascribe market incentives to that, well then you're going to have to explain away the aspects of the US political economy which are politically planned, like supply chains, finances, who can or can't be a producer. You have to have a license to open a firm, and you have to have a license to perform labor in certain political markets. In fact, the U.S. even has, because of financial planning, its own version of what would be referred to in mainstream discourse here as a social credit system. It would be referred to as that in China, but here it's just credit ratings being manipulated by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is, by the way, a branch of the Department of Justice. I've made this observation before, but it's kind of funny when people try. It's kind of amusing, really, to watch both Marxists or quote unquote progressives and American liberals or statist conservatives attempt to explain the difference between the Chinese and the US political economy, especially post 2020, when the US government directly seized like policy, the control of organizational policies for the production of certain commodities, because they're remarkably similar in terms of how both states try to establish their political economies.
Hmm. And I'm just thinking, like, where he's going to try to go with China. I mean, we know that China does a whole bunch of just absolutely shady crap to try to prop up its economy, try to prop up its economic numbers to make itself look significantly more prosperous than it actually is. The most infamous example
Building
being like
cities.
is the most infamous example being the massive ghost cities that they just build out in the middle of nowhere that are like the size of Boston and have a population of around 10,000 at the maximum.
Whereas you see the U.S. government only does that to people who are already inside prisons.
Pretty much. But well, to be fair, China is basically an open air prison as an entire country anyway. Now, I'm trying to think of any of other statistical shenanigans. I know that the Chinese currency or that the Chinese government has been continuously devaluing their currency for a long ass time just to continue to keep that gravy train rolling. I mean, right now
Federal Reserve
it's a
has
the whole national economy is basically a Potemkin economy. It's meant to look great to dazzle people, but once you start to look under the hood, it really starts to become absolutely horrendous. I mean,
kind of like
the extent
kind
to
of
which
like
the government.
right.
Sorry, you were gonna say something?
I was gonna say, kind of like the impression that you get of the U.S. political economy versus what actually happens if you walk down any like downtown area of a nearby city.
Pretty much, except with
In
them, like they have to spend a significantly higher amount of money to come up with all sorts of like crazy, excuse me, all sorts of crazy technological solutions to keep their population in line. You have the social credit system, which is of course particularly infamous. All sorts of cameras and Orwellian surveillance equipment being deployed just for the sole purpose of making sure that their population is not acting counter-economically. Meanwhile, they have some of the most corrupt, what's it called, police states in the world. Corrupt in the
not
sense that,
corrupt,
I mean,
they're
like,
just functioning as intended.
no, 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 they're not functioning as intended. That's why I said corrupt, because
Oh,
because the people there are like the officers are immensely and very easily bribable. Hell,
oh, okay.
many of them actually like make their living taking Bitcoin bribes.
You meant something else,
No, no,
but
no. I meant corruption in the you pay officers to look the other way sort of thing.
okay. Yeah, I was honestly going to be kind of surprised you would describe the state, functioning in a way that's not ideal as corruption. 'Cause that's minarchist talk. But
I'm not. I'm not. I'm not that crazy. But anyways, let's see. Let's. My
yeah,
expectation. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, yeah, going back to the comparisons between the U.S. and the Chinese political economy. Well, you have Silicon Valley over here, and granted, it's usually not the government directly controlling their policies. It's the government planting CIA assets or buying off a big part of their company um, using front groups like InQtel as a way to influence their company policies. Basically, it achieves the same effect.
All right. Anyways, let's continue.
This with massive government industrial spending and social programs that it calls socialist. With a few exceptions, the rest of the world has seen very little progress in reducing poverty. If you exclude China, then not only has the number of people in poverty increased, but the proportion of people in poverty hasn't fared much better, ticking down a measly
Socialism is some vague notion of when workers own the means of production So, but at the same time, when we're trying to make the case for how the state is actually responsible for whatever reason for people not being in poverty, then all of a sudden socialism is when the government does stuff.
Well, you see, socialism is just not capitalism, and because capitalism is just everything I don't like, socialism is therefore everything I do like.
China is a great example that you could point to for the problems with the concepts of both capitalism and socialism, because both I've noticed that both like statist conservatives and like liberals, along with Marxists, do this. They'll point to like the comparison between China while China was being run by Mao Zedong, um, compared to like how they changed up their political economy. There's like a PragerU video about this actually. Um, their state changing its political economy because it was, after the Soviet Union went kaput, they basically had to start outsourcing the control of their political economy to state-backed corporations in order to sustain themselves. Statist conservatives and liberals will point to that as examples of capitalism, but they'll look at all the terrible things that the Chinese government does and they'll say that's socialism. Well, Marxists will do the exact same thing, point to all the terrible things the Chinese government regularly does. That's capitalist influence. But then they'll, if they are making an argument about if they're going to point to the fake laughably wonky statistics put out by the Chinese government, Marxists will point to that and say, see, that's what socialism does. That's state socialism, lifting people out of poverty, subverting capitalist influence. States aren't political class, guys.
Yeah, there was something I was going to say, but I can't quite remember what I was going to say. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue here.
Like Sheldon Richman argued in his lecture that you can find on YouTube, Capitalism versus the Free Market. The fact that you could call yourself a capitalist socialist without any meaningful way of being corrected kind of shows how vapid and meaningless those concepts are, and just how much they obscure discourse. And that's the reason why. That's another reason why I'm not really interested in talking. At the very least, talking about Marxism or responding to Marxists doesn't really interest me, because at some point in any response, I'm going to have to address problems that I have with the concept of capitalism as a way of trying to establish meaning for principles, in the sense of, me being a critic of the idea that economic planning in any sense is ideal or even ethical. And also my criticisms of the notion that everything in a free society is exclusively owned. I've mentioned in several examples of resources which if we were to try and do that with them, would require, in order to defend those exclusive claims, active aggression against existing property owners, which would be, according to the NAP, an active aggression.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, let's continue.
5.4% over 40 years. At that rate, experts project it would take more than 200 years to come close to eliminating poverty. And that's only if there are never any recessions and the global economy manages to reach 173 times its current size.
Oh yeah, I remember what I was going to say now. The increase in economic growth in China is of course attributable to its large population, but we can't also forget that for a long time, China was an agrarian and pre-industrial society all the way through the 20th century. It was only very recently that they started to transition into a more modern neo-mercantilist economy like the United States, which is where Esso was talking about earlier, with the government-backed corporations having outsourced a lot of the government's functions and a lot of their production. So yeah, like when you make that kind of transition from one model or one older model of political economy to another one, that is necessarily going to result in an increase in wealth and an increase in the amount of resources available to both the state and to individuals that are associated with it, which is eventually going to result in a net increase in the standard of living for a lot of people who are kept captive within that political economy, though trying to attribute that to, as Esso discussed earlier, capitalism or socialism, when you can't really have any way of defining either, it just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense.
From an ethical standpoint, people aren't more empowered because the state has the same claim over them and their resources that it did previously. It's just sort of issuing different policies and threatening people differently. And that being said, the only reason that the state did that is because their previous model had become unsustainable. Because people had either developed innovations that made it impossible for institutions designed to uphold that model of organization to continue operating around that model. Or in the case of the Chinese government, it was a puppet state of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union collapsed. So they needed to change their political economy because, again, the institutions allowing their state to operate the way it was were no longer there. But yeah, if you're transitioning from an agrarian economy to a neo-mercantilist model, I think that's a good name for it, neo-mercantilism or neo-feudalism. But it's not that much of a it's not that high of a bar to reach, because you're going from a state which is essentially keeping people landlocked and trying to stop them from associating with one another, to a state which sort of outsources its functions to a handful of politically connected partners. So it's yeah, it's like I mentioned at the beginning of the stream. This is actually a problem I hear a lot with libertarians, is they try to, at least they try to dichotomize their arguments between wealth and or availability of resources and ethical criticism of the state, as though they're two different positions, when in reality that's an incorrect way of thinking about it, that comes from the assumption of ethics being a prescribed system of moral values, as opposed to being just an explanation of what is or is not justified in how people act among one another. An ethical society, because what characterizes an unethical society is the existence of these institutions designed to stop people or harass people from associating with one another. It's subverting their ability to function. The getting rid of coercive institutions necessarily entails more people being empowered and more people having greater access to resources. So, and the reason that I reiterate this point is because this takes the wind out of the sails of like 90% of any statist arguments or any way that they attempt to frame the debate about the issue.
All right. Now let me see here. Yeah, let's continue.
No one expects either of those things to happen. Already, the crisis caused by the coronavirus pandemic has made years' worth of poverty reduction worthless.
God, that sound mixing. It's really hard to hear him. Like what?
Yeah.
You should either allocate that to the left or right channel exclusively, or just tune it down and have Wolff's voice take priority. That kind of stuff is not terribly difficult to do. Just saying.
100 million people have fallen right back into extreme poverty. But the problem isn't the viruses. Viruses come and go. The real problem is the system, a system that implodes every 4 to 7 years.
Fuck, that hurt. It actually hurt my ears.
Yeah, that's what the hell. This is what I talked about earlier in terms of them just like firing anyone of actual creative talent from whatever organization. I actually would not be surprised if the Gravel Institute is just like one guy who probably thinks that they're a lot more talented, clever, and good than they actually are. They just happen to be promoted by the algorithm because they're a bread tuber and they're able to get Richard Wolff on to propagandize to people about how smart he is because he happens to be a tenured professor at a George Soros-funded institution.
Actually, it was an institution founded by the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation promoting Marxism.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Isn't that a thing?
Not terribly.
That's
not
fine.
Terribly surprising, though. I think it's kind of interesting that they brought up the coronavirus. He pointed out earlier, correctly, mind you, that viruses come and go all the time, and they don't cause recessions at all.
Please do not play that again, because
I'm not going to, because that was actually painful. Again, the audio mixing is just this. I don't even know if this qualifies as amateurish, because even amateurs are typically going to be self-aware enough that they're going to do Google searches to figure out, okay, this is what happened. I believe it's called peaking. How do I stop that? Oh, I go to Audacity and hit the compression tool. Okay, now it's not peaking anymore. They would know enough to do that. Whereas this guy, like, this is just like Dunning-Kruger, but for creativity. Someone who thinks that they're just trying to be clever with all of these incredibly loud, obnoxious noises and these unnecessary audio effects and unnecessary visual effects as well. As well as trying to justify the fact that they basically didn't know how to draw at all, but they thought that they could get away with it. They could get away with just like a really low quality, unpleasant to look at art style.
But just back to what you were saying, Richard Wolff's probably going to go on to shoot this sort of ambiguous point in the foot later. But yeah, it shows that so many people are aware of the fact that the lockdown, it's kind of unavoidable at this point for the state to have to deal with the fact that the lockdown, quote unquote, it exposes essentially every problem with political economies that Austrians have been pointing out for the last 100 years. on full display for everyone to see. And I've noticed both controlled opposition appealing to the sort of mega types, but also to the political left having to address that. This is a problem with the system. Yeah, you're goddamn right. The fact that, as I pointed out, this is the result of a sort of countervailing tendency in political economies. In order for political economies to exist, the state has to control the money supply. So a form of fiat has to be established for every economy in its jurisdiction, in order to sort of control how people associate with their resources. Sort of like so instead of making every economy a different jurisdiction with different policies to try and stop them from trading with one another, they just control the money and the supply chains to influence how people associate with their resources, to stop them from using their resources in ways the state doesn't like by exerting a bunch of leverage over them. But yeah, because that has to exist, the state has to engage in QE cycles, which causes inflation. And in order to, that could kill the fiat money system. So in order to prevent that from happening, the state has to control the supply at which it enters into various aspects of the market. And in order to do that, they need to shut down certain firms in the political economy. And, in doing that, they make it so fewer people are associating with the fiat currency and fewer people are operating in the political economy. So there are two different things the state has to do to maintain a political economic model, or really any organization, whatever you want to call it. And those two things very clearly contradict one another. In order to do one, you necessarily have to work against the other.
Although I like the comment that J.C. Armitage made. He didn't say this literally, but he kind of implied it, that the Gravel Institute is actually just a name for a Uyghur slave camp, because that's where this video was edited.
Oh, that's starting to make sense now. But
yeah, it does. It would certainly explain it. Although I think we would see a few more hidden messages asking for help.
But the point that I was getting to, though, is that, that's kind of a glaring problem that I've noticed even a lot of like conservatards beginning to point out. And it's definitely like there have been more agorists and left Rothbardians that have sort of joined the movement and started getting into libertarian circles this year than ever before. So I've noticed a lot of controlled opposition attempts to explain that. Oh, it's just corruption in these policies. Pay no attention to the class interests the state has, or that'll ensure that nothing can ever get done about it, or just the fact that within a prescriptive economic framework, there's no way that the state would ever be able to do anything that would stop this. So the only way to stop it is to subvert the state's institutions. But just ignore all of those outcomes. It's capitalism, or it's China, where it's leftists in charge of these industries.
Anyways, continuing.
More and more people into deep poverty, and which has absolutely no protections for ordinary people when it collapses. Even the defenders of the system have started to admit just how flawed it is. The World Bank itself now says that reducing inequality by just 1% a year would lift more people out of poverty than increasing economic growth by 1% above current forecasts.
Do we are we really terribly concerned about what the World Bank thinks?
Yeah, I thought Marxists were supposed to be at least approaching being as critical of the World Bank as we are, given that it's an organization which exists specifically to try to influence policies set by less influential nations over their local economies.
So you see, the British Empire was absolutely horrible and terrible until the exact same British Empire started making arguments that we need to reduce inequality because inequality is bad, and then all of a sudden they love the British Empire.
The East India Company was imperialist. The problem though is that they didn't openly embrace Marxist socialism. That was
Clearly,
their problem.
I mean, I think I can see. I think from that understanding, it starts to make sense why there is so much like fervent religious zealotry towards SJW causes, because if people can posture themselves to be good little socialists, then that means that they're more likely than not to be spared from the firing squads. It means that them and their families don't get gulagged. Anyway, should we continue?
Yeah, sure.
Say
Nothing really to respond to what Wolff just stated that we haven't already addressed earlier.
Hmm.
some things haven't gotten better. But where they are, it's because of ambitious government programs. That's why Cuba, an avowedly
No.
Hold on a second. I want to hear where this is going.
socialist country under a decades-long embargo has a lower rate of infant mortality, a higher life expectancy, and a higher rate of literacy than the much wealthier United States.
He didn't. No. No.
Oh my god.
No
There are so many
frickin'
things.
way.
There are so many things wrong in just those 5 seconds. It would kind of be difficult to know where to begin. Okay,
No.
first of all, literally the statement before he tried appealing to the fact, well, there's trade embargoes, which Marxists usually point to as a way to explain away problems with Cuba's political economy. He argued just literally the statement prior to bringing that up, that state intervention and state policies, the reason why that's the reason why there's more productivity happening, and that's the reason why more people have greater access to resources. You
Listen,
know what a motherfucking trade embargo is, Richard Wolff.
well, you see, what happened is that it just made Cuba more prosperous somehow. Now, listen. Here's the exact way that the Cuban government is able to get their infant mortality to be lower than the United States's. You see, it's compulsory for mothers to have an abortion if it's discovered that the kid might be born with birth defects or might be born with some complications that would otherwise prevent it from either being born and thus it being counted as a stillbirth or otherwise reduce its life expectancy. And through that government policy, that very wise and benevolent government policy, they're able to reduce their infant mortality to make it look better than it actually would be.
Keep in mind that Cuban hospitals in their political economy, for them, like getting a blood transfusion or having extra oxygen, it would be a bit too much for them for most people. So that could be considered a complication. Yeah, Cuban literacy rates, well, being like 99 to 100%. That's because the Cuban government considers anyone who can write their name be literate.
Which anyone can be taught to memorize how to write a series of glyphs that are their name. That's not the hardest thing in the world to do. That doesn't mean that they can
Anyway,
read. What counts as
what was the other one?
life
Because
expectancy?
life expectancy.
I'm not terribly familiar with how the Cuban government counts life expectancy or the various ways that they alter that statistic in the
Yeah,
title of the
neither
video is
am
in the
I.
way. But considering infant mortality and literacy rates, the way that the Cuban government deliberately modifies those statistics to make themselves look better than they actually are, I wouldn't be surprised if something very similar happens with life expectancy as well.
And also, based on how the Cuban political economy is organized, as well as the fact that, as Richard Wolff mentioned, Cuba is under trade embargoes by several nations. Based on those facts alone, I'm going to have to argue there's probably issues there with the notion that people living in Cuba would supposedly have a higher life expectancy than any other nation except maybe North Korea.
Yeah, that whole thing just does not pass the smell test, especially knowing what we know. Anyways, continuing.
And that's also why the countries with the lowest poverty are places like Denmark and Finland. It's no mystery, no advanced economy.
Denmark and Finland have constantly been pushing back against being used as a statistical benchmark by socialists and Marxists like Richard Wolff. I believe Denmark doesn't have a minimum wage. I know it's one of those Scandinavian countries. I don't
Yeah,
have.
and by the way, that's not like a lot of people will point to that as an example of free markets, but as I pointed out in my last essay, legalization versus freedom. Well, that just means that their political economy is more accessible to a greater number of interests, i.e., the state is making more, it is able to create more resources um, based on what goes on in the political economy, because the political economy contains more economic activity. So that's not something that opponents of Marxists and progressives should be lauding either. I guess you could point to that as an explanation. If they're going to argue that state planning is the explanation for why there are more resources present in the political economy. Strictly in that context, you can maybe make that case, but I hear a lot of people extrapolate from that. Well, no, it's because those places have quote unquote freer markets, and that's a very common mistake I see being made.
Yeah.
Actually, you could argue that their markets, their political economies are more onerous in that regard.
hmm Anyways, let's go ahead and continue. We're gonna need to wrap this up soon because I'm gonna get going.
Has
All
ever
right.
achieved low poverty rates without high levels of government social spending.
I don't know what any of that means.
Throughout this entire video, he's failed to specify what specifically he's suggesting counts as any criteria. He's laying out something like capitalism, socialism, government social spending, social programs, along with what is the sort of causal connection between what he's claiming is his conclusion and what he's suggesting the means for reaching that conclusion are, other than just prefacing prefacing his not his explanation, but pointing to these programs as, well, they're programs that help poor people,
I'm seeing
or
a lot.
they're state policies that disadvantage poor people, but
I'm seeing.
not ever explaining why or how.
I'm seeing a lot of people in the comments pointing out that the statistic for life expectancy from the United States is hilariously outdated because for
I'm sure
2020
that it is.
the life expectancy in the United States is 79 versus Cuba's 76. And
I'm sure that it is.
so I think and we saw this earlier with Richard Wolff cherry picking which types what counts as data that he's going to use, what counts as a social spending program that is good, because social spending programs for things like things are good. He probably means the welfare state, though he never specifies. But the Cuban embargo, that's bad. So I have to imagine that he is very much cherry picking information, which is kind of a problem.
Well, we know that he is based on things that we've seen from him before.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I don't know if I'm
This is
able to
somebody.
go much farther
This is
because I actually do
somebody
got to
keep
get
in
going
mind.
now.
This is somebody keep in mind who thinks that fiat is the same as capital and that there's no difference between a wage and a salary. So, um, like I said in the beginning, even as far as Marxist quote unquote academics go, Wolff is kind of I don't know. If I were if I were trying to look for their best, he would definitely be a bench warmer.
Do they even have a best?
No, they just have people who are more rhetorically savvy.
All right, so basically you have better charlatans,
Yeah.
better
Yeah,
at
I guess keep in mind that's what I'm considering to be their best.
mhm.
And I guess that's kind of a questionable category, but it's questionable categorization. But I guess in terms of them being interesting to argue against, they would I would get more mileage out of them than someone like Wolff.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well. But anyways, I do gotta get going, so let's go ahead and wrap up the stream. You got anything
Uh,
to close us out?
Not really. I think I've said everything that I intended to about the video in the last hour and a half. But yeah, I'm sure this won't be the last time that we'll see the Gravel Institute on the back alley, and we do. I guess I'm gonna have to do something about my audio settings because holy hell, their audio mixing is just terrible.
Yeah, I don't know what the hell they were thinking with that. That is unusually bad. That yeah. Anyways, I actually do gotta get going now. So yeah, thank you everyone for stopping by. We'll have